Greetings, everyone. This is Dr. Cengiz Sisman. Greetings from Turkey and welcome to another episode of Humans of the Ottoman Empire. Today, we will be talking about another exciting subject, one of the most colorful figures in the Ottoman and also Turkish history, Yunus Emre. And we have a very dear guest and also friend from McGill University, Aslıhan Gürbüzel. Aslıhan, hoş geldin. Welcome.
Hoş bulduk. Thank you, Cengiz, for having me, especially for a topic like this. It's a pleasure.
It is our pleasure. It's our pleasure. As you all know, Yunus Emre was a mystic. He was a linguist. He was a poet. He's a philosopher, and he was a man for all seasons, and as Aslıhan would say in a minute. But it would be also unfair to reduce him to Turkish literature and also language, because he was a universal man in the full sense of the term. The topics that he has interested, like love and death and heaven and hell and many more, are the topics that are very much related to common humanity, that many great thinkers, many great philosophers and mystics have been dealing with for ages. And what is Homer or Homeros in Turkish to Greek literature, or what is Shakespeare to English literature, or what is Goethe to German literature, I think Yunus Emre was to Turkish literature and Turkish mystical tradition. So we will be talking about him today, knowing that there are many things which are shrouded in mystery with regard to Yunus Emre. We are not so sure about the biographical details about his life. We have some questions about his works. Nevertheless, we all commonly accept that he was one of the greatest figures in history. Not only again Turkish and Ottoman history, but also I think global mystical and philosophical history. So Aslıhan Gürbüzel, an assistant professor from McGill University, would be the perfect person to talk about this subject, and these subjects rather. She is one of the leading experts on Islamic intellectual and political history and Ottoman history in the largest sense of the term, but with a particular attention, with a particular interest into mystical tradition and history too. Today, as I said, we will be talking about Yunus Emre with her. She's going to tell about her story in a minute. Before I move on into that exciting part, I just would like to remind our audience one more time that this is a moderated discussion. We will be basically having a conversation, though Aslıhan is going to have the largest, of course, share in that conversation. And if you have any questions, please leave your questions, drop your questions into our Q&A box, and please try to keep your questions short so that I can read them at the end of our conversation. So without further ado, I just would like to invite Aslıhan to the podium and then start with the most exciting part and then listen to her own story. Aslıhan, I called her Aslıhan because she's a dear friend from Harvard many years ago, so I have a privilege to call as such. Tell us, please, your story. How did you get an interest into specifically mystical story? I know that your interest is much more than that, but I'm just very curious, rather, listening to your story, because we have another goal in this program is to answer our questions around stories without connecting ourselves from the common humanity. So therefore, your story would interest us a lot. Please.
Well, it's an interesting question, because it's been a long time since I reflected how come I ended up, a historian of Sufism. But one thing I can definitely remember is that if at the beginning of college someone told me you will become a historian, I'd be like, what are you talking about? I really did not enjoy the kind of history one is exposed to in school, which is all political history, military history, but not a lot of cultural and intellectual touch, right?
Right.
So I didn't really enjoy that much. And I started university with an economics degree, like very down to earth, financially oriented person. But I was always a very good reader, and I was blessed to be at a university where there's a very rich library with an open shelf system, which was Bilkent University in Ankara. And this open shelf system means a lot of serendipities and lucky encounters. One encounter, there's that famous sentence from Orhan Pamuk, I read a book and my life changed. So I think one encounter was the collected letters of a there are some noises in the background.
I hear some background noise too. I'm sure that our technical people are going to take care of that. And in case someone left their mic open, please mute yourselves. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. So this book that was a collection of letters that a female Sufi from Skopje wrote to her sheikh. Her name was Asiye Hatun. The letters were published in 1994 or 5 in Turkish with an introduction by Cemal Kafadar, with whom later I had the pleasure of doing my PhD. And I came across these letters completely by chance, and I fell in love with the idea that I could hold in my hands these very private letters from someone who lives so far away in time and place also. So this is something, this archival fever got to me. Like the idea that we can get to this material as historians was new to me. And moreover, the very personal touch of a Sufi woman's writing, which is very inward looking, very emotional looking, was again something that I wasn't exposed to in history books before, but it was something I definitely fell in love with. And that personal inward looking touch is a very pronounced feature of Sufism and Sufi writing. When we look at the pre-modern literary heritage of the Ottoman Empire, all of these autobiographies, all of these dream logs, they almost all come from these Sufi networks because of that culture that inculcates looking in, reflecting on the inward state of oneself and reflecting in that social connections. So I really fell in love with this personal cultural touch in Sufi writing. And I was lucky to be at Bilkent again, where there was a very strong social history tradition. So I started trying out history to see, if it's my thing. And it turned out to be something that I really enjoyed, especially at that intersection of looking at Sufi ideas and how they influence society and how the society influences itself, that intersection of society and these supposedly very much mystical inner ideas that had strong social messages. That's something that I really enjoyed. So I continued to do my PhD on Sufi orders and specifically on preachers of Istanbul and how they shaped the political culture of Istanbul throughout the 17th century. And nowadays I am very much busy with the Mevlevis, which also brought me back to the medieval Anatolian setting that we are gonna be talking about today.
Awesome. So which means that you are also interested in Sufism is not only for the Sufism sake, but you think that this topic is connected to many issues, including political, cultural, and economic at the same time.
Definitely. I mean, we tend to think about Sufism as religious history, like this boxed out detail topic, but in fact, Sufism is very much intellectual history in the sense that it reflects a traditional reflecting on the philosophical heritage of Islam, the sort of social relations, social bonds, the political authority in Islam, and all of these various types. And something we'll talk about today, it's also a place for reflecting on language and human communication. So there are all of these connections that one can explore through just looking at the Sufi literature. It's a very versatile heritage, I would say.
Awesome. I mean, I think Yunus Emre would be the perfect person to talk about all these connections and networks and intersectionality at the same time. Okay, let's just start with the basics then and start talking about our hero, Yunus Emre. I mean, the basic question, of course, who is he? I mean, you know, there are so, I mean, his idea, his identity, his ideas and identity was somewhat, you know, shrouded in mystery. There are many people who are just looking at him from different angles. Some pay more attention to his linguistic power. Some look at his, you know, poetic power, and some consider him only like, you know, a philosopher and mystic. So to you, I mean, who he was, and maybe even more importantly, historically speaking, can we talk about like a historical Yunus Emre? You know?
Right. I mean, so there is the paradox here that the more important a historical figure is, the harder it is to really know who he is, because there's so much myth around him, right? So we have Yunus Emre, who lived, we know, sometime in the late 13th century, died at the very beginning of 14th century, 1310 or 20. So we know we have this person, but we know very little about his biographical life. Compared to that, there's so much written about him in the later centuries. He was a very important figure for Ottoman Sufis and Ottoman historians, so there's a lot written by them about Yunus Emre, most of which is myth, but it's beautiful myth. You don't want to throw it away. Plus, it also shows how much Yunus Emre meant to all of these subsequent generations, although in different ways and with different meanings. So maybe what we can do is to try to sort of talk about him as a person first, and then all these myths surrounding his person in the later periods. Later, to sort of be just to both of these sort of corpus of myth and reality around him. So who he is, actually, there was a lot of confusion around this until recently, but there is a very vibrant research culture around him in Turkey. I should specifically mention the works of Abdülbaki Görpınarlı, Ahmet Yaşar Ocak, and most recently Mustafa Tatçı, who just published a critical edition of his divan, of his collected poetry. So thanks to the works of these people who have really collected all of the manuscripts of Yunus Emre, attributed to Yunus Emre, mentioning Yunus Emre, we have been able to get a few facts down. One of which is that he wrote one of his works, which was Risalet-ül Nushiye, an advice poem, in 1307. So from this, we know that he lived in the second half of the 13th, early 14th century. And thanks to these critical editions of his works, we have some information about Yunus Emre that he mentions in his poetry. What is this information? So we don't know where he was born, but we know where he traveled. So this traveling was very important to the Sufi culture of Yunus Emre, which we can talk about later, but I will just briefly mention his name, for instance. Emre means comrade, hemrah, somebody you walk a long distance with, right? So there is this notion of travel very much ingrained in his life. So we know where he's been. He's been to Anatolia, he's been to Syria, and he's been to the Iranian plateau, presumably Azerbaijan, so he traveled in that regions. We know who his sheikh is, Tapduk Emre, who is a legendary figure himself, and there are multiple graves commemorating Tapduk Emre.
Multiple means like how many? I think there are 4 or 5 already, right? 4 or 5.
There's a long list actually.
Even longer, okay.
There is a longer list. So there are multiple for Tapduk Emre, and there's even more for Yunus Emre himself. And actually there are archival wars in the 40s where Ottoman historians are fighting over which one is the real grave. But I think the consensus is that now it's most likely the one around Eskişehir is the real one. But there are other graves, say in Muğla, so mostly in Western Anatolia, Muğla, Nallıhan, Sakarya, even in Azerbaijan, that are believed to be Yunus Emre's graves and tombs, and they have been believed to be Yunus Emre's tombs since 15th and 16th centuries for a very long time. This just shows us how much people wanted to really connect to Yunus Emre's heritage since the Ottoman times. But coming back to what else we know about him, we know his Sheikh Tabduk Emre, we know other Sufis he was connected with. One of the most important of these is Sarı Saltuk. And I can actually show a drawing of Sarı Saltuk in a minute.
That would be awesome, yeah. Okay.
So let me try to pull that up.
Aslı, while you are showing that to us, may I ask our technical people, I'm receiving some messages from some of the audience saying that they are being removed, apparently accidentally. Is there any technical issues with regard to admitting our audience? I would love you, our technical people to take care of this issue. Some people are apparently are in the meeting, but then they were removed for some reason. Okay, thank you. And Aslıhan, please go ahead.
Thank you. So that gave me some time to pull this image up, which is a 17th century reimagining of Hacı Bektaş in the front and Sarı Saltuk in the back. The labels tell us the story of these two saints of Anatolia around the same time, 13th and 14th centuries. We know that Yunus Emre did not meet Hacı Bektaş, but the Bektashi order later revered and claimed Yunus Emre. But we do know from Yunus Emre's poetry that he was connected to the circles of Sarı Saltuk, a group of Sufis we can collect under the umbrella term kalender. Kalender is a general attitude in Sufism that argues against being absorbed in the formalities of religion and rejecting certain institutionalized demands of Sharia-centered religion, right? So we can talk about this more, but calendars are people who criticized putting down roots, establishing families, sticking to the formalities of religion, because these are all things that make one forget about the reality, which is God. So the calendars vow to take a step back from all of these external occupations of the world to be able to turn to the path of poverty, traveling on the road, not having any possessions, not having worldly status, to be able to really focus on the internal world. So we know that Yunus Emre was from this calendar circles, especially the Babayi circles, which was one of the important Sufi groups supported by Turkomans, the nomadic Turks, who at one point staged a major rebellion against the Anatolian Seljuk state. So there was this fraught relationship between the nomads and the Babayis and the Sarı Seljuk. So he comes from these politically sort of critical circles, which is something we can come back to. He does mention that in poetry. People who are listening to me might not recognize Sarı Saltuk if they're not Ottoman historians, but I'm sure they will recognize another person Yunus Emre mentioned in his poetry a lot, who is Rumi, Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi.
Aslıhan, I want to come to that though, his connections or relations or knowledge of other giant figures in the time. Before that, I still would like to again try to establish his identity. I mean, you said that there are still enough evidence to show us that historically there was such a figure. We know that, and it is also unusual, of course, to think that there were so many other historical figures, right? That their identities were somewhat shrouded in mystery. We don't know. I mean, even about we have discussion about Jesus. There's this historical Jesus discussion where
of course
some claim that no, there was not such a figure, or I mean, there are many other discussions about, of course, Nasreddin Hoca would be another person to think of. As I mentioned at the beginning of my in my introduction, Homer, right? I mean, we don't know much about his historical identity. or even Shakespeare from like 16th century, even early 17th century, there are some questions about the identity of those figures. Therefore, like it is not completely unusual to have a figure and also to have some historical questions around their identity. Nevertheless, as it was in the case of Homeric tradition, we can apparently talk about Yunus Emre tradition, where there was a central historical figure, but there was, he created a tradition in which many other people acted as Yunus Emre or wanted to emulate that tradition, to be part of this tradition, and created that tradition. Can we talk about this tradition, not Yunus Emre identity, historical identity, but like Yunus Emre tradition? What is that?
Right. So let me stop sharing this, but this was just in relation to your question about how do we know this person existed, which is fair enough.
All right.
Because all of the sources we have about Yunus Emre are about a century and a half later than Yunus Emre. So it's a very tricky question, which I would say is what makes late medieval history so exciting, because there are always these challenges.
Puzzles.
One of the ways in which we know that this person existed or wrote is accounts of foreign travelers to Anatolia, who did not write at length about the personality, the life of Yunus Emre, but who nevertheless noted poetry of Yunus Emre. For instance, what you see here is the account of a Hungarian traveler to Turkey, as they called it, where he says, they have a very famous poet, and I'm going to quote a few poetry of him, and he just, like in Latin alphabet, the way he hears it, he writes it down, and then we compare this with manuscripts. So there are these methods that I don't want to get bogged down in, but it's a very fair question that we should always have in mind, this notion that Yunus as a person who had a finite life, and Yunus Emre as an author who was larger than life. Yunus Emre is very important in the construction of a Sufi literature in the Turkish language. So this is important. Turkish literary language is very much new in the 14th century. We have, of course, established Arabic literary tradition. We have an established Persian literary tradition, but writing complex ideas in Turkish, writing literary works in Turkish is very much new. And Yunus Emre is one of the pioneers of the creation of a Turkish vocabulary and terminology in Sufism. And this is what makes him so important, and this is what makes him so much emulated by poets that came after him. So in the Ottoman literature, for instance, we see poets being described as he writes in the style of Yunus. So it's a way of imagining the world. It's a way of using a terminology that's associated with Yunus that is later continued, which is why there are so many Yunuses in the subsequent centuries, and some of them are actually confused with Yunus because somebody sits down and writes in the same voice with the pen name Yunus, because they really are actively emulating Yunus Emre. So this emulation is really interesting in itself and shows us the important place of Yunus Emre as a pioneer of talking about mystical ideas in the Turkish language in a very, very accessible manner, but still reflecting the complexity of the mystical literature we find in Persian.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. I mean, you already, began talking about this complex political, cultural, religious life of Anatolia when Yunus Emre was around. You may want to talk about a bit more about this complexity and dynamism at the same time, where people were on the move all the time. Lots of conversions, reconversions, and also again politics at the time. And how that complexity, could have made an impact on Yunus Emre.
That's a wonderful question, and this is the one place I want to use a map to show where Yunus Emre lived and to show how fragmented his world was in terms of political authority. This was a world very much in the making, constantly changing boundaries and political authorities, right? So we have here, this is after 1246, when the Seljuks are, which was the main power in the region, reduced to very much vassals of the Ilkhans, the Mongol branch, which is ruling in Iran. And there are all these smaller principalities that you see on the map who are making their way towards the west, because it's easier to move towards the west, because it's easier to take over from Byzantium. So this is a time when the Turks are new in Anatolia. They only entered Anatolia in the late 11th century. The Islamization of Anatolia is underway, but very slowly. And the Turks are living in a very much mixed religious and ethnic sort of context in Anatolia. So before the Turks arrived, we had Byzantium, and the population was mostly Armenian and Greeks, Orthodox Christians, but also other churches such as the Assyrians, and then come the Turks. And when we say Turks, we shouldn't be imagining only Muslim Turks, right? There were Buddhist Turks, there were Christian Turks, so the Turks themselves are a mixed bunch. Right. So we do end up, as of the late 11th century, with a very mixed landscape, where there are Armenians, Christians, where there are Turks of all different confessions, Kurds, and Mongols are a very important presence. The Mongol soldiers, but also Mongol settlers. And the migration is not over in the 11th century. There is continuous waves of migration towards Anatolia because of people escaping the Mongols. And because Anatolia is a land of opportunities at the time, because all of these new Turkish principalities are establishing new towns, new villages, and they are looking for people to settle into these places. Moreover, they're establishing new courts, so they're looking for poets. They're looking for scholars who they can employ at these courts. And so, for instance, I just mentioned Rumi, with whom Yunus Emre had an encounter. Rumi's family came to Anatolia because they were escaping the Mongols and because Konya was looking for actively being a patronage center for scholars and poets. So it's a very, very mobile, fast-changing place. And when we read Yunus's poetry, and we always see this motive of traveling, being on the move, meeting people on the move. I mean, of course, there is something that is mystical here, because it also symbolizes an inner travel. But we should also think about his Anatolia, which is literally changing every few years. The other thing
very exciting, too exciting apparently.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it depends if you're an optimist or a pessimist. If you are looking for a frontier to start a new life, it's great. But if you just want some peace
settlement
in your short life, it's not the place to be. But definitely people like Yunus Emre did cherish this notion of fast mobility. It seems from their writings. The other thing I want to mention about this sort of diversity of Anatolia is now we need to talk about Yunus Emre as somebody who's speaking to all of these diverse population groups. We don't imagine Anatolia as a place where, you know, Christians and Muslims and all of these different denominations lived in separated lives. To the contrary, we know that they shared social space. And we also know that they shared even religious ceremonies and religious celebrations. And again, coming back to Yunus Emre's contemporary Rumi, we know from his poetry that he was trying to speak to the Christians as well. He wrote some poetry in Greek, for instance, which is very interesting. His hagiography mentions his close relationship with an Armenian priest. That's also very interesting. So we need to talk about this place, recognizing its diversity. And the Sufi is looking for a language and finding a language that would speak to all of these diverse ethnic and religious backgrounds. That's one of the goals of poetry.
To me, really, I mean, like his interest and also knowledge of other mystical and religious traditions are just fascinating. I mean, he could be, maybe that would be a bit like anachronistic, but he would be like easily a poster child of, you know, interreligious dialogue. You know, I mean, he is just so open to every other traditions in his works.
That's true, and I think that's one of the reasons. Unfortunately, Yunus Emre is not as well known as Rumi, but there is that shared notion in their poetry, and that's what makes Rumi's poetry so alluring to many audiences who are not necessarily, you know, practicing Muslims, but they are drawn to this notion of what the Sufis call the school of love, or the path of love, which is at the center of their teaching. And this is the idea that, yes, God sent 4 books, 4 monotheistic books to his people. But the message of all of those 4 books are actually very much simple, and it's one message. It's the same, and we can actually meet at this fundamental message, which is the message of love, mezhebi ishq, as the Sufis call it. And this is the idea.
I mean, I'm definitely going to talk about the centrality of love. I thought maybe a bit later. Before that, I'm still like, you know, trying to cover the historicity of you know, his life and works. Again, you mentioned his connection to, you know, the Mevlevi tradition, and maybe even Arabi tradition, and a lot of traditions. So I mean, I want you to, like, you know, say a few things about, like, you know, again, his knowledge and interest into the existing other mystical or religious traditions, and again, names like you already mentioned. Again, just to talk about it with them, and after that, you know, I would love to see how, if any, he was like departing from the existing traditions and trying to create something authentic and new and vernacular. But before his difference, seeing, like, you know, discussing his difference, if there was any again, let's just see or try to understand his connection, interest, knowledge of the existing traditions.
Right. So thank you very much for that question, because it's something that's very much misunderstood about Yunus Emre for a very long time. People assume that he was not learned and he was out and out illiterate, unlettered for a long time. And this is a misconception, and it's a very naive reading of how Yunus describes himself. And he does describe himself as ummi, which we can translate it illiterate, but illiterate is a very pejorative term in our societies, right? Whereas in Islamic culture, when you say ummi, this word for illiterate, the first person that comes to your mind is the Prophet.
Right.
And in Islamic culture, ummi stands for the idea that the Prophet's knowledge was directly from God, from being exposed to divine knowledge. There was no intermediation, be it schools, books, teachers, nothing. He was directly learning from God. And ummi stands for this idea of learning directly from God. And Yunus Emre describes himself as someone who is ummi in the sense of his heart is directly receiving knowledge and inspiration from God. He says somewhere, if I can quote like a small couplet, he says, "Gönül kitabından okur, eline kalem almadı." He says, "I recite from the book of my heart. I have never taken a pen in my hand." In doing this, he's trying to emphasize the immediacy of learning about God. You know, you don't need to go to a madrasa. You don't need to study the Quranic exegesis in its fullness to understand God, because God is, as the Quran says, closer to you than your jugular vein. You just need to polish your heart and God will manifest himself. So he is using ummi in the sense of criticizing bookish knowledge. The idea that if one studies this many books, one understands God, to him is misled. So he is trying to recite from the path of heart and show other people that they can do the same even if they haven't been to this madrasa or that madrasa. So this is purely discursive. He is using this to evoke this idea of direct access to God, but we do know that he is literate in Persian because he translated poetry from Rumi and he translated poetry from Saadi and integrated that into his own collected poetry. So he knows that tradition very well. He most likely was educated in Konya. This is a theory, we don't have proof, but most likely because we know he visited Mevlana, he's been in Konya, and because we know he knows the tradition. So we need to take that with a grain of salt, that he was learned in these traditions, even if he doesn't want to present his authority by basing himself on the books that he has read. So coming back to your question, in light of this idea of him saying he's not learned but actually knowing the tradition, what's this tradition that he knows, right?
Right.
So you mentioned Ibn Arabi, and I'm grateful for you. I could have forgotten that because it's one of the people he wasn't in direct connection with. But Ibn Arabi did live in Konya for a short period in the early 13th century. He then moved to Damascus, which is one of the places that Yunus Emre traveled in. And more importantly, in Konya, after Ibn Arabi's visit, there was a long-lived Ibn Arabi tradition that is sustained by Sadreddin Konevi and other figures. So the Ibn Arabi school is very strong in Anatolia and especially in Konya. And of course, we can see Rumi's own poetry as a reflection of this close relationship with Ibn Arabi and his idea of the unity of being, the unity of the universe's meaning.
Yes, it is kind of almost a quote-unquote, some form of pantheism, quote-unquote again.
Almost, right. I mean, pantheism is often, often used to describe this tradition, but I really am for using unity of being. Because that's the term that we see in Yunus's poetry, and because that's the term that Yunus explains to us so well that we really don't need to replace it with something that's easier to understand, because he makes it so open to us what he means by this, and we can come to that when we discuss his poetry. So maybe one interesting thing about the people, the tradition he was in connection with is, we said Ibn Arabi, we said he's been in the majlises, in the gatherings of Rumi, and he writes about this in his poetry. Something that's interesting is that he mentions that he was in a sema, this musical dance gathering of Rumi, and he also mentions himself as doing sema, doing the whirling of the dervishes. And this is something that becomes a story later in the tradition. Yunus Emre is presented as this musician who goes to the court of Rumi to play a certain instrument, and then he's inspired by his poetry and all of that. So when we say Yunus Emre, and today we only buy a book from the bookshop and read him on the page, but we are actually talking about a living oral tradition in the form of performances, sometimes musical performances, that is part of why his poetry is so accessible, because he's trying to speak to all of these diverse audiences in this performance setting.
Okay, Aslan, the time is just passing by so fast, as we all know. Would you like unsharing the PowerPoint first? Sure. And maybe since you talk about Ibn Arabi and Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, can you say a few things about his interest or connection to Hacı Bektaşi Veli? Because later on we also know that the Bektaşi tradition adopts him as well, and as we also know that his poems or ilahis, hymns, were chanted in all kinds of Sufi and Bektashi, the convents. I mean, he was the most known figures in those circles. And again, can you say a few things about his connection to Hacı Bektaşi Veli, Bektashi tradition?
Yeah, So, I mean, we do know that, so the Bektashi tradition was committed to writing in the 15th century after Yunus, and the Bektashi tradition claimed a lot of these Kalanderi dervishes of Anatolia that weren't necessarily disciples of Hacı Bektaş. So we can talk about Yunus as one of these Kalanderi, like, in the broad sense, dervishes that weren't directly in the vicinity of Hacı Bektaş, but then later claimed by the tradition because of the proximity of their teachings. But that said, even in the Bektashi hagiography, in which Yunus Emre is mentioned, the author says Yunus Emre came to Hacı Bektaş. So the story, let me tell the story very briefly. The story is that Yunus Emre is wandering and looking for a sheikh who is going to be amenable to his own way of looking at the world, right? So he's going from door to door. He's looking for the sheikh that would be best for his spiritual learning. He goes to Hacı Bektaş. Hacı Bektaş asks him, do you want wheat, or do you want my blessing? Which is like a difficult choice, I guess, because Yunus Emre keeps saying, well, I have children at home, I really need to feed them, give me the wheat, I'm going to go back. So probably this is at the beginning of his suluk, his path. So he does prefer to feed his children over the sheikh's blessing. And Hacı Bektaş, as in hagiographical manner, asks it 3 times, and he says 3 times, just give me wheat, my children are hungry, I need the wheat. And as soon as he takes the wheat and leaves, he regrets this. He's like, what have I done? How can I prefer food over spiritual blessing? What have I done? I need to go and change this, undo this. And he goes back to Hacı Bektaş and says, I've been stupid. I have made the wrong choice here. Please give me your blessing. And Hacı Bektaş says, well, that ship has sailed. I'm not the sheikh for you, but I know who is the sheikh for you. So I will send you to Tapduk Emre, and you will be trained there. So even in the Hacı Bektaş tradition that kind of claims him, it's sort of acknowledged that he wasn't formally trained with Hacı Bektaş. But Hacı Bektaş appears as the sheikh who actually told Yunus Emre who would be the best sheikh for him, Tapduk Emre. And Tapduk Emre does end up being really the inspirational sheikh for Yunus Emre. We have a lot of stories about how Yunus Emre was so taken by the sheikh and so dedicated to him that he went above and beyond in all of his duties. For instance, in Sufism, the sheikh asks you to serve at the lodge to the other dervishes, to the visitors, to be able to make sure that the dervish can subdue their ego. Right, they can become a mere servant to the sheikh, and they can subdue their ego to the sheikh. So there is this requirement of service, and Yunus Emre went above and beyond whenever the sheikh asked him to, for instance, bring wood to, heat up the lodge. It's a very famous story. He would look for straight, like the most straight, beautiful logs, even though they'd be burned in a couple of minutes, and he would say, not even crooked wood can enter this lodge. This is such a place of purity and beauty and straightforwardness. I can't do this. This part is very well known, but there's a sequel to this story which is not well known, which I really like. So if I can briefly narrate that. So
please go ahead.
Yeah, please. He is very much going above and beyond in serving the sheikh, and the other dervishes are puzzled. They're like, why is he doing this? He can just take any wood, the sheikh would be fine. Why is he being so dutiful? And one of the other dervishes decides that Yunus Emre must be doing this because he's in love with the sheikh's daughter. The sheikh's daughter is a beautiful daughter, and also she has a beautiful voice. When she recites poetry, everything stops according to hagiographies. The rivers stop flowing, the wind stops, everything stops because she has such a great voice. So the dervishes decide this must be the reason Yunus Emre must be in love with this girl. That must be the reason he's so much dedicated. And when the sheikh hears this, he actually marries Yunus Emre with his daughter. But it's also told in hagiographies that Yunus Emre never consummates this marriage because he always thinks he's not deserving of the Sheikh's daughter. So there is always that notion of humility, him being very humble and not actually feeling entitled to worldly positions or any kind of acknowledgement, and just completely selflessly dedicating himself to the Sheikh. So these are the stories that we see about Yunus Emre in the posterity. Hacı Bektaş, the other thing about Bektashi tradition is that it's one of the many traditions in the Ottoman Empire that claimed Yunus Emre. And some of these traditions really twisted Yunus Emre and tried to make it fit to their own sort of interpretation of Islam, right? So, for instance, in the 18th century, a sheikh from Bursa claimed that Yunus Emre was a Naqshbandi and was a mufti.
There you go.
Yeah, was a mufti, even though he has all this poetry against muftis and all of that. There's so many different traditions in the Ottoman Empire that claimed Yunus Emre in their own ways. And that try to sort of make him fit into all their own interpretations of Islam. That's one of the reasons why there's all this sort of shroud of mystery around him.
Yeah, I would like to again also talk about this, reception and also perception of him in different times in history, maybe toward the end. At this point, we now Yunus Emre, historically we establish his identity, his works, and then his connections to all around him. Now maybe we can briefly talk about, though that could be the really most important question about him, his uniqueness, his contribution, his being the founder of Turkish folk poetry, Turkish language, even like Turkish, vernacularized Turkish mysticism. Not in depth, but can we talk about again his contribution or his departure from the earlier existing tradition and then creating something new, which is going to be fitting very well to the emergent new Turco-Islamic, Ottoman, whatever you want to call it, culture, mystical culture. How central he was to this new tradition.
So that's a great question, and if I may, because you asked me to tell stories, so I'm telling a story to answer this.
Please go ahead. Stories are always giving lots of answers.
I mean, there's a reason they've survived centuries, right? Because they say so many things about these figures. So there's a story that's posthumously attributed to Yunus Emre. According to the story, Yunus Emre meets Rumi. We know they meet, but this story doesn't happen. So they meet, and Yunus Emre takes a look at Rumi's magnum opus, Mesnevi, which is a long poem in 6 volumes, right? He looks at this and he says to Rumi, this is a good work, but if it was me, I could have summed this up in just one couplet. Ete kemiğe büründüm, Yunus diye göründüm. I have donned flesh and blood, and I made myself manifest as Yunus. So the idea of God making himself manifest through human beings, and according to Yunus, this is the sort of kernel of Mesnevi. The thing that's interesting here is a response to your question is that Yunus doesn't find fault with the Mesnevi. He agrees with its content. So he is not. By
the way, we need to perhaps remind our audience that Mesnevi was written in Persian originally.
Right, exactly. Right? I'm sorry. Yeah, Mesnevi was Rumi's magnum opus, written in 6 volumes in Persian. So he, and we know Yunus Emre read Rumi, but the thing is, he doesn't diverge in terms of content. He does actually, because of the setting that I tried to describe, is that he's trying to speak to the lowest common denominator of the society. So he's not diverging in any fundamental way from this mezhebi ishq, from the school of love. But his expression, this idea of being able to sum up 6 volumes in one couplet And that's really what Yunus's contribution was, making what we consider today even like an obscure, difficult, mystical philosophy, right? That's, there is some sort of distance for most people of when you say mysticism, they assume it's something difficult to fathom. But his contribution was to make the main ideas, the main parameters of this mystical thought accessible in very simple language. When the Ottomans remembered Yunus Emre, they remembered him as the foremost representative of the literary art of Sehli Mümteni, which is to say a poem which is extremely simple in its outlook, in the first instance, but full of many layers of philosophy and mysticism. So he was considered the master of this simplified complexity.
Right.
And because he was so successful at this, he was the first person to sort of set up the parameters of how do I speak about unity in Turkish? How do I speak about the stations of the Sufi in Turkish? All of these terminological inventions was attributed to Yunus and was reproduced after Yunus. So I think the main connection is that linguistic connection that made mystical poetry relatable to larger crowds.
Yes, that's awesome. Again, the fact that he was simplifying language, mystical, religious, language which were mainly in Arabic and Persian, and now he was Turkifying it, simplifying it, and maybe becoming instrumental in disseminating this mystical tradition in those days, Anatolia.
Exactly.
Okay.
If I may add one more thing.
Please go ahead.
He was actually popular beyond Anatolia. So one of the earliest manuscripts of Yunus Emre we have is from the Mamluk court. So we know that there's some sort of a cosmopolitan interest in this new idiom that is spearheaded by Yunus Emre. And I wanted to mention this because we tend to think with like nationalist categories back, like Turkish is the language of Turkey, so it was spoken in what is now Turkey. Whereas in Yunus's time, there was some sort of vernacular potential or cosmopolitan potential of Turkish. And his poetry was well received beyond Anatolia as well. So it's this moment of the making of a new literary language, which is exciting for many courts in the region.
Okay, that's also very important to again think of him being beyond the borders of Turkish or Turkic context, and then making him almost universal as early as the 14th and 15th centuries. Let's speculate very briefly on his works. Again, there's another like popular understanding or misunderstanding about his works, thinking that all of the hymns and poems that we are reading today are written or were written by him. So if I ask you more, almost scandalously, how much of the poem that we attribute to him today were actually his? Do we have any knowledge about that? Can we say anything about that?
So there's so much attributed to him that it's difficult to sort of say there are like 10 volumes of pseudo Yunus. We don't know how much is attributed to him afterlife. But thanks to the work of these scholars that I mentioned, we can actually talk about a body of work that has been published, and I can recommend to readers if they're interested, that has been established to be by Yunus Emre. And this has been established by methods of, say, looking at the language and trying to understand whether this could be 14th century or is it post-14th century. So there is that philological work going on, there is that manuscript work going on. So we have a body of work that we know belongs to Yunus. But beyond that, there's also like a vast world of world of poetry that is attributed to Yunus, and even the Ottomans were aware of this notion of, real Yunus and fake Yunus. They were aware there are so many Yunuses in circulation, and there are discussions of this in the Ottoman times, which is interesting. So for instance, there are stories of like a more, how can I say, strict conservative ulama going after Yunus's poetry and burning it down because there's so much that's attributed and that's wrong. But then they come to a real Yunus line, and then they realize they're making a mistake, and they let all of these poems live. So there is a lot that's misattributed, but we don't need to be agnostic about Yunus Emre. We are at a point in the 40s, in the 50s, it was a complete sort of like nebulous land of what is Yunus and what is not. And the reason why it was so nebulous is because the research was not as strong, but also because in the Republican times, Yunus Emre was taken to be someone who is more secular. And so some of his more religious poetry, say praising the Prophet, was considered not fit for Yunus Emre. So these assumptions of what could Yunus Emre have said actually damaged Yunus Emre's studies for a long time. But at this point, as I said, there is no reason to be agnostic about, Yunus is completely agnostic. There is a body of literature, but we can safely assume to be Yunus Emre's. At least there is no counter evidence at the moment.
That's amazing, of course. That ambiguity or nebulousness, as you were saying, would be also an interesting thing for those who are, appropriating him in retrospect, and then using, selecting certain poems and then just simply denying or disregarding the others. That would give them a good excuse, of course, to create their own narratives or even myths.
Exactly.
That would be interesting to say.
Exactly.
Speaking of Jam, you already mentioned about his various reception in the Ottoman Empire, but as you already alluded, he was also used almost like a national or nationalistic poem or poet in the Republican times. I mean, can you tell about his adventure in modern Turkish Republican times? I mean, how he was perceived or received by the modern Turks?
Right. So, I mean, it's a really interesting adventure that actually goes back to Ziya Gökalp and the early nationalists. I'm not going to go that far, but in very general terms, one of the intellectual challenges of the new Turkish Republic was to establish a canon. What are Turkish classicals, right? What is Turkish identity? Who represents this Turkish identity? So maybe some of our members of audience will know the Hasan Ali Yücel Classics series, for instance, which was a project that the Ministry of Education, Hasan Ali Yücel, began in 1940s to form a canon of works that will be the basis of Turkish cultural identity and from which the Republic's literary production would sort of follow. So he came up with this proposal of nearly 400 works that need to be translated into Turkish and become familiar to the Turkish youth. Of these 400 works, 66 of them only were what he called Şark Klasikleri, Oriental classics, which is already a small number. And most of that 66 is Persian or Arabic literature, and there are only, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 3 works in Turkish. And Yunus Emre is one of these 3 works. So that shows us the sort of place Yunus Emre held for the identity of early Republican Turkey that was being constructed at this time. What these people were looking for was simple Turkish. The idea that Arabic and Persian are almost sort of genetically incompatible with Turkish identity, and the simple Turkish folk, in quotes, had their own identity, which was expressed through poetry like Yunus's. And despite all the Ottoman rule and everything, this Turkish identity came uninterrupted to the Republican time, and the Republic was now claiming this medieval Turkish heritage. So the main thing about this Turkish identity was that its language was Turkish, pure Turkish, and it was more secular in outlook, in the sense that even if there were mentions of the Prophet, mentions of God, the religiosity that we see in Yunus's work was very much adaptable to what the Republic liked to call humanism.
Right.
This idea that this is in Islamic garb, Yunus's poetry is in Islamic garb, but it's actually very much capable of being read as secular because the Turkish character is secular, right?
And part of humanistic tradition.
Exactly, like this general notion of humanism, which is what the classics represented, right? You go back to ancient Greece, you go to England, and what you find in common is this humanistic emphasis. And of course, Yunus's emphasis on love, on embracing like all religions, all sects, that actually helped in sort of reclaiming him as someone who represents a form of Turkish religiosity, which is different from any other religiosity, in the sense of its being tolerant, in the sense of it being, for instance, more egalitarian in gender matters, or it being in the sense that it's more universal than being like closed.
Universal is the term, yeah. Universal.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a very important moment for Hasan Ali Yücel classics, but also all throughout 40s and 50s. The notion of simple Turkish was very much shaped around the work of Yunus Emre, and it's a period in which Yunus Emre research took up. I think I was mentioning to you yesterday, some operation took place where they dug up his skull from one of his
That's a fascinating story. You have to tell a bit more, yeah. Just tell that story.
Yeah, I mean, so 30s and 40s, but mostly 30s, is the high point of anthropometry, this notion of measuring human skeleton to sort of find out about their
skulls too.
Skulls, yeah. And to find out about their nationality and national characters was very much on the rise, and Turkey was part of the sort of searching for the national character and trying to prove that Anatolia was the homeland of the Turks by measuring skulls and showing that most of the graves were by like people who were ethnically Turk. So there was this moment of measuring the skulls of famous celebrities, for instance, Mimar Sinan, because we now know that he was of Greek origin. At the time, there was also rumors that he could be Armenian origin because of where he came from. So they dug up his skull to prove that he was pure and simple Turkish. So there is this movement of, measuring skulls to show that this is actually the Turkish homeland. And of course, for Yunus Emre, the reason the skull was measured up was not so much to prove that he was Turkish, there was no doubt about that, but to sort of try to make a character analysis based on these measurements. And then the report, which is published somewhere, says that he was a very intelligent man and he died at the age of 80. And of course. So,
and he was pure Turk, of course.
Of course, yeah, that was no question. So there is this interesting fascination, and Cengiz, maybe you would remember the way we learned about Yunus Emre at school. I kind of have all of these recollections of, the expression of Turkish soul, the expression of, Turkish wisdom, and all of that. So he was very much part of, the common imagination, national education, and all of that. And I'm not going to say everything that was written about Yunus Emre.
He was part of this Republican culture.
Right, exactly. And some even say the Republic discovered him, which is not right. We know that he was still revered in the Ottoman times, but the Republic sort of remade his identity in a different way. That's not to say, though, that everything that we read in the Republican times about Yunus Emre is wrong. There is really valuable research. The main thing is that we can say this for the Ottoman Sheikh who considered Yunus Emre to be an Akşebendi, the Bektaşis, the Republic, some people who are into Yunus Emre now, they were just being selective, leaving out some aspects that didn't fit the narrative, and sort of taking in those other aspects that fit a certain narrative. This is what they were doing. And I think, there's nothing so contrary to Yunus Emre's own message of being so close to somebody else's truth, right? The whole message is be open to other people's truth so that you can expand your own heart. So if there is one message I can give, is to sort of look at all of these pictures in conjunction to get a sense of Yunus Emre as a whole.
Great message. That would really end our conversation very nicely. Though there is one central concept that we just visited in passing, but I want to end with that concept, which is ashk and love. To him, this is central. I mean, more than faith or practice or belief or anything, more than anything else, love is the one which sticks everything together, like that. Explains the unity of the beings that we have been talking about, and also explains our connection to the world, to the heavens, to everything. I mean, with your note on the ashk, or love, I would love to end, and should you be my guest to say a few things about, again, his version of ashk, love, and let's conclude our discussion here.
Right. So the main thing I want to say about this is that this is one of the places where I really don't sort of approve, if I may, of describing Yunus Emre's emphasis on love as humanist, because his understanding of love is very much a product of mystical tradition, the Islamic mystical tradition, Sufi tradition. And what is that? So I will show some of his predecessors in this path of love. But the main message in Islamic mysticism is that human connection is one of the most important paths to understanding God for two reasons. One, humans are mirrors to each other. So if I want to look inward, and if I want to understand what are my shortcomings, where I need to work on myself, the way to understand myself is to look at the mirror of other people, to make connections with other people, and to learn from them about themselves and about myself. So the only way for me to really be able to understand my shortcomings as a human being is to be in touch with other human beings, that idea of mirror. The other sense in which humans are mirrors is that we are all mirrors of God. God is infinite, his beauty is infinite, his knowledge is infinite, and no book can contain this infinite knowledge and love. But why God created the universe according to Sufi tradition is that he still wanted to be known and he still wanted to be loved. So he created the universe and he put a fragment of his beauty, his knowledge, his wrath, his jealousy, his good characters, his bad characters, because he's inclusive of all of these things. So he placed all of these fragments of his beauty into human beings and into the nature. So in this sense too, the way that I can understand the transcendent principle of the universe, which is God, is to really look into the mirror of the universe to see all of these different manifestations of God. So this is why human connection, being in the company of dervishes, being in the company of a good sheikh, somehow making that connection is very much fundamental to the school of love, because a human rational mind is incapable of understanding God, but we can only purify our soul by looking at the mirror of other people who will show us ourselves and who will show us our God. It's in this sense that his understanding of Mezhebi Ashk, of the school of love, is very much steeped in Sufi thought. And there's just one image I want to share, is one of his inspirations in this path of love. Mezhebi Ashk is also one of the first martyrs of Sufism, who is, I hope you can see it, Hallaji Mansur. Here you see an Ottoman era depiction of him being executed for saying "En el-Hak," I am God. So the idea here is that the mystic who loses himself in God can actually fail to see that there is anything in the universe other than God, right? I am so much lost in the love of God that I fail to see any difference between, the tree that's in front of my house and myself and God. Like, it all becomes one, this notion of unity of being. And there are utterances the mystics say to sort of express this notion of being one with God. And one of that was "En el-Hak," that is attributed to Hallaji Mansur, which is very well known, "I am God." This is an inspiration for Yunus Emre, and he does quote Mansur in his poetry. And he actually writes similar poetry that can be compared to Hallaji's, this notion of transcendental love, in which one loses oneself in God, right? So if you see the one in the bottom, I am before, I am after, the soul for all souls all the way. I'm the one with the helping hand, ready for those gone wild astray. Evvel benam, ahir benam. This is one of the most famous ilahis, hymns of Yunus Emre that's still sung today. If you look at the original, Evvel and Ahir are attributes of God. God is eternal, therefore he is both the first and the latest. He's also who helps the poor, the destitute. So Yunus is saying, I am all of these attributes of God because I have become one with God, and I can feel all of those attributes in the mirror of my heart. And these are, of course, poems that can be seen as transgressive from a more sort of Sharia centered point of view. And he does acknowledge that not everyone is going to understand these sort of more transgressive expressions. But nevertheless, I will close with this. Nevertheless, the path of love, mezhebi ishq, is also open to those who are not open to the message of love.
Thank you very much. That would be a great ending, Aslan. Thank you very much. I mean, we just went a bit over time, but I was not able to stop you because of the passion, your passion into the subject, and I really, we all immensely enjoyed it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much
for your like very rich and textured and full of insightful, responses. And I also would like to thank all the audience who have been staying with us so far. And I just want to say goodbye until next time.
Do we not take the questions?
I'm sorry?
Are we not taking the questions?
Oh, actually, the thing is, we went a bit over time.
Okay.
I don't want to go too much over time. Yeah, if you would like to select, please go ahead. I mean, if you feel like responding, yes, please.
Yeah, just because they ask about the translations of Yunus Emre's poetry, I would like to point.
I'm sorry, you missed that.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are two translations that we see here. One of them is by Talat Halman, and the other one is by Grace Martin Smith. These are the main translations in English that are credible. That I would recommend to readers who want to follow this talk up with more Yunus Emre, and I definitely recommend reading him, especially at times like this, to find solace. But I think the main thing I want to recommend is that you should learn Turkish if you are interested in Yunus Emre, to be not missing all of these references that are not necessarily transparent in English. But if you are starting with reading him in English, I would recommend the translations by Halman and by Grace Smith.
Awesome. And we will be looking forward to reading your works on the subject too. Thank you very much again, one more time. Okay. One more time, have a great day or evening, wherever you are, and I hope to see you in our coming episodes on the